translation, either from Indonesia to English or vice versa. And also, I will explain a little bit the background of this discussion. This event is actually a special moment for us to commemorate 10 years of our journey in ISF Indonesia. And for 10 years, we have positioned ourselves through voluntarism, collaborating with diverse people and communities across background. And we aim to challenge mainstream spatial practices through architectural intervention, developing participatory approach that treat context not as a backdrop, but as active and generative agent. And this anniversary also becomes a moment for reflection for us. We begin to rethink whether the participatory approach can be used as a process for collective imagination, and how can this approach contribute to the discourse of critical spatial practice in the middle of climate and struggle for spatial justice. And through this series, there will be another series next week. We will invite public to explore critical spatial practices and drawn from local and international case studies, practices that are tactical, strategic, responsive, yet also scalable and transformative. Before we begin, there are some few brief notes. There will be 3 speakers joining us for this session. And after each of the speaker presentation, will followed by open discussion and Q&A for each of the speakers. And please keep your microphone muted and feel free to pose questions if you have during the presentation, or you can raise your hand once the presentation finishes. So before we start up to our first speaker, I will remind you again of our theme. The theme is Reclaiming Spatial Future, emerges from the urgent condition we are living in, where boundaries between human and nature, design and destruction have become increasingly blurred. And we invite to reflect how architecture can respond to these realities, not as isolated of building, but also as a critical interconnected spatial practices. In this session, we will hear from 3 speakers who work span from environmental activism and documentation to participatory design and community resilience. Together, they'll help us to unpack the role of architecture and spatial practices in facing ecological and social ruptures. So let's begin to our first speaker. I will introduce to Mr. Hendro Sangkoyo, or usually known as Pak Yoyo. He is the co-founder of the School of Democratic Economics, known for his deep engagement with ecological policies and community-based knowledge production. His work questions the structures of extraction and invite us to rethink ecological relations from the perspective of justice and sovereignty. So, Pak Yoyo, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning there in Indonesian time. This is actually 1 o'clock in Brazil, where I'm speaking from. I'm sorry, I'm probably causing some delays as well because there's some glitch in the internet connections here. Okay, let me, first of all, I'd like to congratulate, but also thanks the committee that set up this very interesting exchange. This is actually timely and or overdue probably because as we all are aware, the core issues that has been presented by Kusno just now is actually it's been here for quite a while, since well 1980s probably or 1990s, but forgive me if I'm sounds a bit too extreme, but I haven't actually seen any radical break in the idea of developing the kind of life enclosures that really fitting the crisis. That's my first statement. We can discuss, of course, and you can debate me. And in the let me begin with the idea of climate change. That's really actually at euphemisms. This is actually accumulated crisis engendered by capitalisms, if I may, as we all know. And it links directly with the energy consumption, but also with the how the circulations and chains of value and materials affect not only us humankind, but also our life space. So I will also use the word life space liberally, and because the idea of life space is actually, first of all, historical. I can say it is a historical social ecological entity that's not bounded by, for example, political conceptions like nation states and all that, but it's there with human in it. But we cannot separate even the idea of us human with the non-human parts of this historical social ecological entity, or its SEE. So I and friends at the school network has been using this, I would say, bridging construct to engage people in the traditions of social sciences and humanities, but on the other hand, people in the traditions or hard sciences, including earth sciences, to think through what we have been doing to this vital, say, container of life on Earth. And this talk about spatial, the future of spatial space, something like that. It's actually in the heart of the question. So I appreciate again the initiatives from SWIT. And
Yeah, I think we just lost Bayoyo. We will wait for a second. Hopefully he can rejoin again soon.
hello, sorry. I think I just kicked out. The connection is not that great here. Can I do screen sharing?
Yes. I think you let me see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me start with something familiar for Indonesians. This is a part of our archipelago, and the one in bounded by this red lines ellipse is actually a kind of sacrifice zone in the new scheme or scenario of energy transitions. And this is actually closely related to the ones that I just mentioned. This is all actually every single dot, small and big islands in the ellipse within the actually historical social ecological entity. And if you see in the bottom part of the pictures, you see something like drilling towers and all that. That's the whole island of Flores. That 8 years ago in 2017, it's been declared or expropriated as space for the energy industry, more specifically the geothermal mining, to produce electricity. But it's not for the idea of strengthen the infrastructures for settlements, human settlements, and to support, the creations of livable city and all that. This is all for the extractive industries and also exported. And it's part of actually a humongous network from Australia all the way to Bangkok and beyond. And it's called the ASEAN Grid. That's now it's in the making. So what we see here is exactly the theme of our exchange today. This is actually a snippet of the future. But if you look at very carefully the map, I can probably zoom a bit here. You see the eastern part of the island of Sulawesi and the whole thing of Maluku actually, even not with the reddish grid rasters here, like the whole island of Halmahera actually. It's now becoming the, I call it the nickel bowl of Indonesia. We have in Indonesia actually the biggest deposits of nickel laterite, and the second is the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. And we both women and men in the Philippines and in the Indonesian islands of Sulawesi, Maluku, all the way to the Cyclops Mountains in West Papua, are now being, I would say, attacked actually by this new frantic rush for battery minerals, nickels, cobalts, graphite, manganese, and all that. And we now being unified as never before, it's unprecedented, unified with countries like Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, in the ABC countries, the three South American countries that I just mentioned. There are huge salt lakes or salt seas. It's called salar, and it's now the target for the energy industry to get the lithium from these huge salars. It's a mess, and it's a devastation for the indigenous peoples, for because it's complex, very complex, and lithium mining is actually water mining, and so it destroys the very limited reserves of fresh waters in the salars. So this is actually it sounds like having an oblique connections to our topics, but it's not. Actually, it's in the heart of it. So to return to the all that I just mentioned about the how we should put the professions, the endeavor of creating human enclosures, the best we can. Actually, it's contingent on how we treat our crisis. And of course, you can say that, well, this is not our cup of coffee. Let's just give this challenge to the politicians, the geologists, But if we think about it, the first victims of this kind of detachment or indifference is actually those in the forefront of this new expanded extractivisms that I can tell one by one every country, because at the School of Democratic Economics, we've keeping track of social and ecological change across the globe for about 170 countries. This sounds a bit bizarre and too ambitious, but we do it since 2007, so it's already more than 17 years. And so one more thing that I'd like to show is actually the let's show you some. Okay. Forgive me, just let me do some. I'm not sure if the animations will do, so I just put this circle diagrams. This is actually also part of the challenge that the organizations who promotes and organize this actions should really think through together with friends across many other disciplines. What you see here on the left part is actually the path of energy transitions. You see from the bottom, you see coal, oil and gas, hydropower, meaning damming the waterscapes, and geothermal mining that I just mentioned, all the way to chemical cells or battery. This is just some of the primary energy sources that it's becoming the staple, not only for the energy industry, but for urban development, for architectures in the making, and all that. And so we are being lured into thinking that, well, it's a must. Climate change, the cause of it is global warming, and the global warming phenomenon is caused by too much greenhouse gas emissions. The only way to deal with the crisis is actually to curb the emissions. This incomplete and deceivingly simple logic is actually omitting the whole social, ecological, and political context. So we need to question these future-oriented questions posed by the organizers in historical perspectives. I have a friend, and she's actually, I think, writing and keep on writing sort of nuisance to many people in the trade. And her name is Kara Gagets, and her dissertations was turned into a book, and the title of the book is The Birthday of Energy. Birthday of Energy. So what is it? Energy has been there since pre-memorial time. No. The idea of energy with capital E, actually it's part of the Industrial Revolutions, as we know, particularly in search for coal, for steam engines. This is actually the strategic ingredient, strategic material base of colonialisms in the Netherlands Indies, for example. in order to consolidate the regions, the Dutch in this military governments deployed many gunboats, attacking, pacifying people's unrest. And what they need is actually courts. And of course, it began in the archipelago called now United Kingdoms, where all this particularly started. And on the right, actually, of this wheels is the impact or the footprint, social and ecological footprints of all these five examples of primary energy sources. The first one is actually biosphere breakdown. It's actually very horrifying idea if we take the whole the meanings in the broadest sense. And we are all, no matter your vocations, trades, professions, livelihood, it's really haunting all of us now, and nobody in the right mind can dismiss this. The second is actually, of course, intertwined with the first, is ecological devastations at multi-level expressions. So the one that I just mentioned in the whole islands of Maluku, Sulawesi, all the way to West Papua, it's actually it's a living proof of what happens. And I make the career actually to be a true vagabond since we set up the school actually, to listen very carefully to people on the grounds, indigenous architects of Bali, Sulawesi, small islands and all that, and try to understand, the weight of the crisis. So ecological devastations, either in the terrestrial part of the islands or the waterscapes, rivers, aquifers, lakes and all that. It's just beyond words. The third is actually one particular impacts being induced by specific kind of minings. Now it's overwhelmingly proven in geothermal mining. Not only in Indonesia. Indonesia is really big for those of you who are not familiar with it, with the issue, because the whole Indonesian islands is actually a major part of the so-called Ring of Fire in the Pacifics, in Asia Pacifics. And it means all the way from the tip of Aceh and the northern Sumatra to the Banda Aceh and beyond, actually, and the islands in between, Java in particular, actually is dotted by hundreds of volcanoes, but also very critical in terms of tectonic formations. So, in the words of my adopted families in Bali, we all live actually on the shoulders of porpoise. It's very shaky and very precarious conditions to talk about architecture, talk about urban developments and all that. And subsidence and induced seismicity is directly linked to deep mining to extract not minerals, but the heat from the crust, the earth crust. It could be 2,000 to 5,000 meters for a start. And you can imagine the whole thing is actually being disrupted, including the gaseous compositions, the stability of the layers, geological layers and all that. And one particular country that also actually has been suffering for this, but somehow eluded in the coverage of the Western media, for example, is Italy. Italy is actually big on geothermals, particularly for the province of Tuscany or Toscana, where about 70% of the electricity for the whole province actually is from geothermal mine. About more than 35 geothermal power plants, and it's growing. And it's a big issue for friends there who also fight against this idea about geothermal mining for power plant is safe. And you can check, I can share with you later. And the last one is actually human suffering. And human suffering actually relates to all three impacts before. An example, in November 15, 2017, the big city of Pohang in South Korea underwent a huge earthquakes, 5.4 on the scale. And then the earthquake later on discovered exactly is on top of a shaft or well for geothermal mining. And it's a very special technology. It's called enhanced geothermal systems. And so, of course, I and friends at school actually, frantically try to get all informations. I myself, for example, read about 200 journal articles to understand the very specific kind of earthquakes. And it actually then refuted the idea claimed by the industry that geothermal power plants, if at all they produce negative effects in terms of tectonic disasters, it's only tremor between 1 to 3 on scale Richter first. And this is not only, we're not only talking about Italy, South Korea, or Indonesia. We documented dozens of other phenomena, which also link to the idea of creating big dams, reservoirs for hydropower plants. Again, in Indonesia, in the big islands of Kalimantan or Borneo, we've seen, I think, two of the most atrocious attack to our life space. The ones that we architects, although I may not qualify as active ones, try to make it better. That's always the premise, right, for the disciplines that we are all in. And the two biggest projects now for hydropower is the Kayan River hydropower projects and the Mantarang Induk. In all, they will produce more than 10 gigawatts of electricity. And it's not at all for the Punan peoples that 6,000 years ago start colonizing the islands, but it's for export, actually exactly for the feeding the ASEAN grid, Singapore, Malaysia, and all the way to Angkor, and probably some to goes further north. And I've been going back and forth to Mantarang, and the last time actually to Kayan, listening to old friends from Wanadri, for example, that made very special expeditions. And they call it, this is probably the last expeditions to the Big Kayan River, because afterwards it will be submerged, swamped by these projects. What does it mean? When the water is rising 230 meters from the current levels. All forms of life, all the hunting tracks, all the life of newborn babies, kids, women, men, is gone forever. And because it's huge projects, actually it's called national strategic projects. It means we people should not speak out and should not say no to this. Otherwise, we are put in a special category of criminal activities. So this is going on, and I just want to share just one more slides actually. Can you see the new slides, or is still fixed on the old side? Because some disconnect is always happen with Zoom and Keynote. Can you see the new slides with many
Yes, we can.
features in it? Hello?
Yeah, we can see the next slide on 10 slide restructuring.
Okay, good. So I just put the whole story of this energy transitions in a sequence of 4 movements in Marxian terms. The first is actually we are now seeing the restructuring of the global value chains and material from energy supply chains. And the wheel that we just saw is actually is at work in this idea. In 2011, the WTO and JETRO of Japan pronounced a new policy framework for the world trade, and it's called Made in the World. You can see it's in the leftmost column. And what it means, there will be no calculations of trade balance, trade deficits, and all that. They start moving towards something else. There will be no made in Indonesia or made in China, even commodities. It's all made in the world. And it's, you know, with huge impacts on the whole things. We cannot say no to nickel mining throughout our archipelago, because we now don't talk about the international divisions of labor, but international divisions of tasks. And the task is crucial, is sine qua non for the internationally fragmented production processes. A Volvo car, used to be in Sweden, is actually a part of this made in the world processes, involving about 70 distinct processes in dozens of countries. The same with nickels. So it's very complex processes, and in the process, we see the killings of marine animals, terrestrial animals, the intoxications of the whole food chains for humankind. And this is all happening across the globe, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Argentina, Bolivian, and Chilean salars, and in many different parts of the globe. So, and then the idea of restructurings of the global value chains and supply chains, particularly, sort of induce chain reactions. One glaring example is the Belt and Road initiatives from Xi Jinping. It used to be called One Belt, One Roads, but to sounds more inclusive, then they changed the name. And it's, if you look at the map very carefully, you can check later on if you haven't. It's again devastating disruptions, because those countries and territories, including the urban populations, the indigenous peoples in the interiors, and that are all affected. Indonesia is actually also jump wagon in 2017 when the think tank in Japan is called AREA. It's a research institute for ASEAN and East Asia, sort of helping giving birth to the so-called MP3 AI, or the master plan for the development and expansions of Indonesian economy. And the whole archipelago of Indonesia, it's about 280 million people there, all the way from Sumatra to West Papua, is being chopped off, if I may, and transformed on paper, of course, still, into 6 corridors of extractivisms, of energy productions, of markets, all the whole things. And it's devastating. My school took initiatives to check the first corridors that cover the whole Sumatra and a bit of Banten in West Java, and scrutinize it with the Indonesian Research Council. And I also engaged 2 research institutes in Malaysia and Singapore. And the finding is unbelievably devastating. It's like a big leap backwards to the colonial times when the coal is big in Sumatra, particularly in the Ombilin mines. And this is going on and on in Africa and India. India doesn't want to join, of course, the Belt and Road initiatives. India sets up its own corridors, it's called. And also the whole Latin America and the Caribbean also, join the story. The second column actually is the financial, legal, and political infrastructures for these energy transitions. I don't want to, discuss one by one, but this is also impacting Indonesia. I was there during the summit for G20 countries in Bali, for example, and it produced new huge sovereign debts and private debts. It's called Just Energy Transition Program for Indonesia. And Indonesia is the second country after South Africa. How large? It's $20 billion. So on paper, the first $10 billion is dedicated for energy transitions, including the early retirements of all coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. That's also on paper. And the second is even more ridiculous. Actually, we will decide later. But please sign this agreement. So the Indonesian president at the time signed a letter of intent saying yes to all this scenario. This, of course, expense goes to many other countries. One particular network now in operations in Indonesia, it's called the ASEAN Zero Emission Community, belong to Japan actually, and it's kind of asset management in terms of energy and extractive industries. So this ASEC managers, so to speak, working together with many institutions in the countries represented, including some international NGOs that sort of pays blind eye to all this crisis nowadays and try to engage themselves into this new rush. And the third one is actually what happened, and this is actually a big homework for people in the trade, the architects, the seriously critical urban developers, planners, economists, and all that. Try to move back and make distance from all this gung-ho industrial imaginations about the world we live. And the all the things that actually happens since 1997 with the Kyoto Protocols and then strengthened with the Paris Agreement in 2015 somehow caused the squeeze the space and times of natural and social processes, the social ecological processes of capital in the move. And we can see this in many countries. And we, in the bottom of this third columns, you see representations of the Indonesian archipelago with reddish parts of it actually rendered in red. And this is actually tedious work that we did since using the statistics in 1984 all the way until 2012. What happened afterwards? We cannot get the statistics anymore, and we use directly the official statistics from the Ministry of Public Works, Director Generals of Water Development. What happened here is actually an exponential growth of crises across the waterscapes in Indonesia, which for the surface water, it's divided into 89, the so-called river management units. In 1984, 29 out of these 89 waterscapes are declared bankrupt or near bankrupt. 8 years later, in 1992, a year before the UNFCCC set up, it increased into 39, and then 1 year before the Asian economic crisis in 1997, it went up to 59 out of 89 waterscapes. It's more than 2/3. What happened afterwards, of course, it's not getting better, and there is no reparations, recovery, big, campaigns, announcements from the governments or for the industry, and so it's getting worse. Exactly on top of these worsening conditions, and for the life of the people affected by all these waterscapes, because water is, of course, the blood films of life. On top of this crisis, the government pushed with the hydropowers. And this is not, of course, a sovereign decisions. It's part of this, the whole setting. On the last column, we see representations of human body, actually a woman body. And I put the whole big landmass of Asia and the Indonesian archipelagic parts of South Asia beneath these human figures. What it represents is actually the direct links between the well-being of our body, humankind, with extractivisms, with energy productions, with all the economic parts that's considered important for progress. And this is actually the work is actually been done by an institute. It's called Institute of Natural and Social Health in Argentina for years, actually. And they try to find the link, mobilizing physicists, doctors, social scientists, and all that. So if there's some big mining projects in Argentina and some parts, and then they will dig into it and checking, make inquiry with all the peoples there, particularly the women parts of the populations. And so you see direct connections with the production's ability of with cancers, with many different destructions in the neural systems and all that. With all these projects, not only mining, but many others, farms and military conflicts and all that. And a few years ago, I contacted them and I asked permissions to translate it into Indonesians. And now, then my schools endorse and work together with many friends on the islands, actually, also to apply this idea of cuerpo territorio in Spanish, the link between the corpus, the body, and the territories. So I can go on and on, but I just want to maybe just two last slides. One is actually this. This is my friend, my close friend. His name is Tom Goldtooth. He's the co-founders of the so-called Indigenous Environmental Networks. It's a global networks, but he operates from North America. He's also a chief, one of the major tribes. And what he's holding is actually a poster showing the IMF versions of a whale with dollar signs on it, if you can see this. And this is part of the protests being waged by Tom and some indigenous leaders, women leaders and all that, during the 29th Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC in Baku, Azerbaijan. So before the one in Belém now in Brazil. What happened there is actually officially whales is now considered as carbon stock. So if I were the CEO or actually a CEO of an oil company, British Petroleum or Medco or anything else, then I can continue, opens up new gas and oil fields. This is actually has been done by all European countries, having humongous oil and gas fields in North Sea. And
I'm sorry,
I can
Yoyo.
still say,
You have a few minutes left, so if you can wrap up.
okay, yeah, I'm wrapping up.
Yeah.
So you can somehow compensate my sins. I can compensate by buying carbon credits. So there's a financial transactions to deceive natures that, look, I've done my due and I paid my fees and all that. This is really the most foolish response to the crisis. And this is actually the kind of networks that work. And this is the challenge posed by the organizer of this exchange. If you really are willing to handle this and work together with many different other disciplines to start thinking about the futures of our living enclosures, particularly the human-built enclosures. So I will stop there and thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bayoyo. It was such a thought-provoking presentation, and of course, it's not going to be enough for just 30 minutes. With a focus on macrostructural ecological thinking, sometimes we forgot, and you already set the tone of the ecological degradation and energy transition that support extractive capitalism. So I know that some of you already have some questions, but since we have very limited time and our second speaker is already here, so please save your questions for later. We will combine the discussion after the second presentation. So I'm going to check to Faten, are you here? Yeah, Faten Kikano. I think she's already here.
Okay, now I can, but I cannot open my camera. Is this on purpose? I cannot open my camera.
Oh yeah, it's okay. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'm going to excuse me.
You don't want me to open my camera?
You can. Maybe when you're joined, there's something on the setting of the link that doesn't allow you to open, but we actually allow everyone to open their camera.
All right, I'm trying, but okay.
Yeah. I will try to ask you to start video from the Zoom meeting. Hopefully it will work. Oh yeah, now it worked.
Yeah, you can see me?
Yes, we can see you. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so okay, thank you, Faten. I think it's already really late at your place. It's
Yes.
also actually the
Yes.
same goes with Payoyo as well. So everyone is coming from different place right now. So
I see.
yeah, so I will introduce you first to our participant. So our second speaker is Faten Picano. She's an architect and educator from ASF Quebec, whose work center on participatory design, resilience, and post-disaster recovery. She will share her insight on how collaborative design processes can empower communities and reimagine architecture as a shared responsibility. So, Faten, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. How much time do I have?
Around 30 minutes.
Okay, very good. May I just ask if the questions are after my presentation? If there are any questions, could they be right after my presentation?
Yes, all of the question will be after your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. Yeah, now we
And
can see
now?
it. Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, wonderful. But I cannot see you, but I'm gonna try to enlarge this so that I can at least. Okay. All right. So I am going to shift to something very different from what the first presenter was mentioning, and focus on the link between governance and making of home in times of conflict. So how the absence of governance in most host countries impact the making of home for refugees and migrants. So I did my PhD on the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Started my PhD on space. So I was looking at marks, cultural marks in the space. I was looking at shapes, volumes, textures, materials. What you can see in this picture is Moune. It's actually the winter reserve that Syrian women and Lebanese women produce for the winter. So this is the type of things that I was actually looking at. But I ended up by doing a transdisciplinary thesis, and I looked at power and how power actually impacted the space appropriation. And when I say power, power could be economic, it could be political, it could be through the legal status of people, it could be through the number of people. So there are different forms of power that I looked at. And that was my conceptual framework. So space appropriation was in the middle. And I tried to look at power, space typology, and culture, and how those three different concepts impacted space appropriation. So the questions that I asked myself was the following. Do migrants and refugees reproduce home away from home? Or does the place they occupy remain a shelter? And in both cases, what are the factors that impact them the most? Because in the literature, there is a focus on camp spaces and non-camp spaces. And the understanding is that camp spaces do not become home, and non-camp spaces become home. Urban spaces can become home more than camps. And this is something that during my thesis, I kind of nuanced a lot. So where are the forcibly displaced people? There are millions and millions of displaced people in the world, and the number keeps growing according to the UNHCR. Almost 85% of these people, despite what the media shows and all the vote people and all the nationalist discourses in countries, almost 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries with a fragile governance structure. Despite studies that show that the average of a refugee situation, according to the UNHCR, is 26 years, these countries, due to their fragile governance, adopt short-term approaches and policies of exclusion, believing that these policies will drive refugees outside of the countries, outside of the host countries. And in reality, what happens is that these policies of exclusion drive increased refugees' governance and prevent them from leaving the host country, prevent them from repatriating, and prevent them from resettling. On the right, we can see the camp that the construction of the camp was starting in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. So how does the absence of governance in these developing countries, where 85% of refugees are hosted, how does the absence of governance or the weak governance system impact the making of home? Well, one of my first results that I'm going to prove to you through 2 case studies is that the vacuum of governance or the weakness of governance is filled by power. And the other point is that refugee spaces become a continuum between ghettos and places of segregation. And in most cases, this transformation is independent from space typology. So whether it's a camp or an apartment in an urban area, it's the power that refugees have through their legal status, through their social connections, or through the policies that are imposed on them that allow them to reproduce home away from home. So I'm going to talk about the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The Syrian refugee crisis started in 2012 and is still ongoing. So Lebanon is a very small country for those who do not know it. And it's a country of almost 4 million people. And it's hosting a very large number of refugees per capita, almost 1,500,000 refugees. Besides hosting refugees, Lebanon experienced in 2020 the explosion of the city, of the capital, Beirut. And this generated a lot of internal displacement. So another layer of vulnerable communities was added to the refugee community. Besides the refugee crisis and the Beirut explosion, the Israel-Hezbollah conflict that started in 2024 also caused the displacement of many families from the south that took refuge in other parts of the country. So this multiple crisis, these multiple layers of crisis in a country that is already characterized by weak governance, impacted the situation of refugees in a very significant manner. We go back to when Lebanon, when the Syrian crisis, when the Syrian war started and Lebanon was opened the borders, thinking, like in most cases, that the crisis is going to end in a few months. But we're in 2025, and there are still a large number of refugees that are hosted in Lebanon. So Lebanon kept the borders open at first, but then the country closed its border, but it was too late because the refugees were inside the country with no plan for any home, no camps. So the international community praised the country for not putting refugees in camps. However, the country prevented the UNHCR from registering refugees a while after the crisis started in 2014. And the Lebanese government was almost absent from the management of the crisis. And this made the municipalities govern the crisis. And the result was we had different system of governance within these small countries. So some municipalities were hospitable, some municipalities did not accept to host refugees. So this created an imbalance. But from a research point of view, it was interesting because one could see different systems of hosting refugees within the same country. I will talk about the case of Nabaa. Nabaa is a small neighborhood, a poor neighborhood actually, at the east of Beirut. And it is part of a larger sector in Beirut that is called Burj Hamoud. Now, what was particular about Nabaa? Well, as you can see in the picture, it's a neighborhood that is formed by buildings, quite densely populated. And also what you can see from the picture, it's from a socioeconomic perspective, it's a quite vulnerable place. But what was particular about Nabaa is that it hosted like 2/3 of its inhabitants, after a few months of the crisis, of the beginning of the crisis, became Syrian refugees. So 15,000 people were Syrian refugees. And what was particular is that Burj Hamoud, so the area around Nabaa, governed by an Armenian head of the municipality, did not have this large number of refugees. Actually, there were very, very few refugees. What was very strange is that Nabha, the owners and like the house owners, the apartment owners, and the shop owners were from the Hezbollah, were Shia from the Hezbollah, with an allegiance to the Syrian government. And what I could not understand is that how these refugees that were fleeing a regime that is an ally of the Hezbollah would stay in an area that was like, that had a large population. Most of the population was the Hezbollah. And I couldn't understand this contradiction until I started interviewing people and investigating. The conditions of refugees in Nabha, Syrian refugees, was very, very bad because they lived in very like places that were not living spaces. Like this man who built a small mezzanine in his shop. And there are families that lived in basement without ventilation, without light, and you know, people lived in terrible, terrible, terrible conditions. When I started to talk to people, I understood that they were often evicted, that they sometimes they would work and receive no wages, and that there was a lot of aggressivity and violence towards them. What was not understandable is that why they would stay. But investigating even more, this is another type of sheltering on the rooftop of a building. It's a group of men, no women, of course, but it's a group of men who was living there. Investigating more, I found out that the governance, so the municipality of Bir Hamoud, the area that I have showed previously, the municipality did not have any control on the inhabitants of Nabha, who are Shia with an allegiance to the Hezbollah. Because they were backed by the militia, nobody could apply the rules. What were the rules? The rules was no apartment can be inhabited by more than one family. But what they did was divide apartments into small rooms with makeshift kitchens and toilets, kick out the Lebanese tenant, and rent the apartment to several Syrian families. Given the fact that the municipality couldn't do anything about it, Syrians could live there in any conditions and any form. Moreover, the municipal police couldn't do anything, and the army couldn't do anything. So in other words, the oppressors of the Syrian refugees became their protectors, because from a governance perspective, they were more powerful than the municipal police, that the head of the municipality. They were more powerful than the country and the law, and they would allow Syrians to live in whatever way, exploit them with the rent, but at the same time protect them from being caught by the municipal police or by the army. Why would they be caught? Because they didn't have any legal status in the country, because the Lebanese government, the only action that it took was preventing them from having any temporary status. So yes, it's a neighborhood with buildings and apartments, but I called it the city camp. Due to the lack of governance on behalf of the country, refugees depended on humanitarian aid. They had to they were evicted, so there was no residential stability for them. And there was no space appropriation. There were no marks in the space of any cultural object because people didn't know if they were going to remain in the apartment or the room that they rent. In other words, the structure or the typology of the space did not influence the level of space appropriation or the level of homemaking. And the freedom to stay that the Lebanese government was praised for was actually a double-edged knife because it exposed Syrian refugees to a lot of vulnerability from other actors. Now we will look at another case, and it's an informal camp in the Bekaa. Pardon?
It's okay, you can continue.
Okay. So it's an informal encampment occupied by 90 Syrian families in the Bekaa Valley. So the Bekaa is the area, a plateau with agricultural land, as you can see here in the picture. And it's on the border between Lebanon and Syria. And actually, this camp is on agricultural land. And Dalhamiye, the area where the encampment was built, is affiliated with the municipality of Zahle. Zahle is the capital of the Bekaa. So normally, the informal camps are the poorest type of settlement for refugees. However, this encampment had a different story. I will tell you the story, but I have to tell you first that when I met the head of the municipality in Zahle, Zahle is a Christian area. So Lebanon is a country that is characterized by a balance between religions. And the civil war and the occupation of the Syrian army was still in the minds of people. So Zahle is still a Christian area, and when I interviewed him, he said, "As long as we don't see them, I don't want to do anything with them." So in the case of Nab'a, the head of the municipality could not apply the law, could not have any form of governance or control. In the case of Zahle, the head of the municipality did not want to have any control, did not want to have anything to do with managing the refugees as long as they remain invisible. So in agricultural land, far from the urban city. So this is the story of the governance and why this camp was not governed by the municipality. Now, what is particular about this camp is that unlike other camps in the Bekaa Valley, this camp was occupied by families who actually had some money, because some of the men used to work in Lebanon before the war and got the Lebanese citizenship. So they did not have this fragility that most refugees in Nab'a had. With a legal status, they could not be afraid to be arrested by the army or anything of that sort. The other thing is that they had money that was coming from abroad because part of their family was in Sweden and they were well off. When I asked them, why didn't you live in the city? The answer was, well, we can afford to live in the city, in Zahle, but people will be annoying with us first. And second, we won't be able to reproduce our culture and our tradition and live with our social and cultural practices. Here in this camp, we can live the way we used to live in Syria. So this is one of the units from inside. It's called Madafi, and it's actually a very, very culturally appropriated space with marks and tissues and carpets and stuff to make the coffee and so on. So it does not look like a camp. From outside it does, but from inside it does not. It looks like a permanent living space. These are from other shelters in the camp, and they were nice spaces and beautifully decorated and showed a sign of permanence. So maybe you can do the parallel, the apartments that are temporary, and actually the sheets and the wood studs and the temporary materials that were used in this camp that actually reflected permanence and a strong space appropriation. So at first, when I visited the camp, I was, Syrians are very hospitable people in whatever conditions they are. So I was nicely hosted by the women in the camp. But the more time passed, because I visited my spaces, my case studies, I visited them every 6 months to see the evolution. As time passed, I was not welcome in the camp anymore. So the camp was closing on itself, and it became auto-governed. So the fact that the municipality didn't take care about the camp allowed the camp shawish, the shawish is in Arabic the camp manager, allowed him to have a full control on the camp to prevent people from entering the camp space. And well, it is an agricultural land, so also it was difficult to evict these people if ever, and to regain access to the land and to use it as an agricultural land. So you see these spaces, but we didn't know what happened in the camp because we couldn't see all the spaces. One of the times that I was hosted, I was able to take these pictures as well. And these pictures reflect hierarchy in the camp. They reflect a power structure that was created within the camp, where the shawish was the head of the pyramid and other people were less privileged than some people. So this ghettoization of the camp, the fact that the camp became autonomous and auto-governed, yes, it allowed refugees to appropriate. The first picture I showed you, with the Mune was from this camp, from a woman that I used to visit in the camp. But there were also shelters that were extremely vulnerable, showing that we didn't really know how other people were treated in this camp. Was there weapons? Was there drug? Was there abuse of children, abuse of women? Nobody would know. And that is dangerous for the refugees and for the host communities alike. So, sorry, this scheme is in French because my thesis was in French, but it shows how the power from the Lebanese government, from the Ministry of Social Affairs, from the army, was shifted to land or house owners and employers. So these are the rich Lebanese community, and to the shawish, who is the camp manager. And all of these represented new power structures that protected refugees, but at the same time exploited them. And the fact that they exploited them, refugees became a cheap labor market, and they also became a replacement in the housing and in the labor for poor Lebanese communities. And this generated a lot of tension and a lot of hatred between both poor communities, and made both communities even poorer and even more vulnerable. So in the case of Nabaa, it is this scheme that happened without the governance, the strong governance of a country that could actually manage properly a refugee crisis. What happened was that these people, the Syrian refugees, were actually prisoners in Nabaa because they couldn't leave. They had exploitation, eviction, they endure violence at some times. However, they couldn't leave because their prison protected them, gave them the opportunity to be housed, even if it's in miserable conditions. The space typology did not affect this and did not influence the level of space appropriation. In the other case, the case of the informal settlement in Dalhamiya, in the Bekaa, the settlement, because the power imbalance is different and there is no governance either, the power came from inside. So the camp, despite the fact that it's tarpaulin sheets and wood studs and temporary material, the camp became a ghetto that nobody could enter and nobody could control. And it was very, very, strongly appropriated. So I end my presentation with this slide. War is the product of rich countries and the problem of poor countries. This is not my citation, it's the citation of a researcher called Noble. But poor countries with poor governance manage refugee crisis in a way that impacts negatively refugees and poor communities in these countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faten, for your presentation and explain how powers support space appropriation and help those even more micro governance inside of those camp. So since you're here, I think it's a bit unusual, but we will have to have quick photo together before you leave, because you have very limited time and it's already late in your place. So I hope that someone can help me to take photograph together, to take a photo together, and please turn on your camera. We will continue on the discussion after the photo session. So yeah, for the participant, you may open your camera now. We still have, yeah, they're still processing on turning on the camera. And Mascano, who's going to take the photo? Yeah, okay. Okay, so if everyone is ready, I think there are still some of you who are still off. Okay, we will begin the photo session together. Now, 1, 2, 3, slide 1. Okay. Is it taken, Moscano? Yeah, okay, so slide 2. Is it done? Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you, everyone. So let's continue on the discussion. I think I may have question first to Faten in elaboration from Payoyo's presentation. So in the previous talk, Payoyo described how structural system from ecological, political, economic can shape condition that the crisis of multiple scales. And how do you see this relationship between those microstructure of power and the micro act of homemaking that communities in both Syria and Lebanon perform?
So your question is, how do I see these microstructures of governance, how they affect the homemaking?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your question. So those microstructures actually, they, given the fact that refugees are extremely vulnerable, most of them, those microstructures prevent an equitable management of the refugee crisis. So the refugees who have who became Lebanese citizens before the years of war, or the refugees who have some money and or have some connections and have a steady work, those refugees benefit from the absence of governance. But other refugees are exploited by these refugees. Like one of the camps I visited in Lebanon, the Shawish would only, power is by numbers. So if you are a refugee in a foreign countries, you need to be within a community to have some form of security. You cannot be alone. So you go to the Shawish and you ask the Shawish the permission to stay in their camp. The condition is that you work for the Shawish. You work for the Shawish from the morning till the night in the agriculture work, and you get paid maybe $2, and the Shawish take the rest of the money. So this is the condition for you to stay in the camp that the Shawish is running. So these micro, and at the same time, in urban spaces, Syrian refugees replaced the poor Lebanese that used to rent their houses in these poor neighborhoods and that used to work. So as I explained in my presentation, those microstructures benefit the powerful, even the powerful Lebanese. The landowner is renting the land way more expensive than if it was agriculture. Even if they plant diamonds, the price of the rental is higher, whatever they plant in the land. People who rented the apartments also made a lot of money. So the rich Lebanese and the Syrian refugees who were more privileged and in a better, with better conditions from a legal perspective and from a socio-economic perspective, the absence of governance benefited for these people because they could exploit the others. And homemaking depended so much on the power. So when people talk about refugee being a temporary situation, temporary is politic. It's a politic speech. There is nothing temporary. If you sit in a room for one day, you will pause your computer, you will put your jacket, you will put your water bottle, and you will start to appropriate the space. Space appropriation does not depend on time. It depends on stability and control and power.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know
So-
if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think Payoyo also wants to elaborate more on these questions.
Okay, thank you, Kusno. Well, thank you so much, Fatan, and it's really a pleasure to listen to you. And it's really extremely important work. I hope we all can learn more from Fatan Kitano. I have two interrelated questions, actually. You mentioned in one of your slides that when government is missing, then power take over, something like that. But mine, us all actually, the governments in the area, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, not to mention Israel, and probably government of occupied Palestine, for example, are governments in conflict, first of all. And every single one of them came to their current statecraft conditions and political stance through a very long historical processes since at least the Ottoman Empire. And what you see, and this is very important observations, of course, is actually also part of, I would say, more complex portrayal of the fate of ordinary people in the camps. And of course, a huge complex of refugee camps there. And I've been following through the UN channels and all that for already a few years now. And so it's I think, first of all, government is part of the problems there. And lately, actually, I've been digging more into the stories from not from the mainstream looking in from outside, but from the voices of women in northern Syria, in Rojava particularly. Of course, it's related to the Rojava revolutions of the Kurdish social movements. And if you look at very carefully, the questions being raised by Abdullah Öcalan, for example, and then it's also collective questions by the people finding refuge in many different spots throughout the territories. It's what you describe an excellent way, the complexity of space productions and all that. It's part of the more crucial questions of how we all actually live in this superficially correct and normal, state politics or interstate politics, but it's not. There's a saying, of course, SNAFU, system normal, all fucked up. And this is exactly in the Middle East, in this area that you described in Naba. This is really paramount. So I wonder if you have also tried to link your research with the voices of the women, particularly in northern Syria. It's for those who are not familiar. So the Kurdistan is actually, it's a very complicated concepts of territories, including the refugee camps and all that you described. And it's what's so interesting is that the territories that they feel historically as their life space, their living space, is actually now bounded by 4 or probably more if you put NATO in it and all that, other nation states. So the most recent development in their political thinking is actually to ditch the armed struggle and try to think through how to say no, how to better say no to the formations of nation states that really strangle their lives and sort of blocking the visions to think about the future. I wonder if you could comment a bit on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your question. And I am really impressed with your knowledge of the area and of the complex dynamics. I totally agree with you regarding governments and that governments are the problem. I can talk about Lebanon. Lebanon, after the years of civil war, was destroyed by the corruption of its leaders. And so this is why the area is so unstable. And when I talk about weak governance, it's because of these issues. Unfortunately, I do not know much about women in Syria, in the areas you are describing, and it would be extremely interesting to try to understand homemaking and space appropriation in these areas. What I can tell you is my research did not focus on gender, did not focus on women, but throughout the research, I found that the role of women was crucial in homemaking. So even though women are excluded from the deals between the UNHCR and the Shawish or other men in the camp, women, they used to take papers and pens and help me draw their small habitat and how they divided it. They were the architects of their homes, and they actually build the homes. Like if you remember in one of the pictures, there were textiles, because it's traditional in Syrian houses that the walls and the ceilings are covered with this type of textile, with the pompon and the stuff that goes down, and all of these shapes. I'm sorry, but it's very late and I'm used to describing these in French. So forgive me if my English is not perfect tonight. So they did that. The women did that. And and the shelters, even though from outside you see that they don't look so nice and clean, from inside they are so clean because they clean their spaces all the time. There is this way of looking at a refugee camp as if it's not a clean space. It's cleaner than our own houses. And they remove all the textile, wash it, and then put it up again. And it's a very difficult job for women to do, and they do it. But they're excluded from the talks, they're excluded from the deals, and the research doesn't highlight their role enough. But they play a very crucial role in homemaking, in home designing, and in home building even. Hopefully I will be able to do some research about women in the upcoming month, about the role of women, not specifically in refugee camp, but in situations of post-conflict and post-disaster reconstruction.
Yeah, thank you, Kikana and Payoyo, to
Thank
raise
you.
new discussion here. We're talking about gender role, and I think it is always important, also reflecting to what ISF did with some of the kampung, that women is always have very crucial role in connecting the community. And before we move to Mas Kamil, I think he already left something on chat and now he's raising hand. I just want to remind some participant, if you want to, if you have question in Indonesia, please do not hesitate to reach us through Jaladri or Nida. We can translate it for you, but now I will move to Mas Kamil. So Mas Kamil, if you have any question.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Fatin. It was very illuminating, and so much of it resonates with what ASF Indonesia have been doing, as Hani had mentioned, and my personal research as well. And one thing that struck with me is this idea of homemaking post, I guess, post disaster, post calamity, post, a very troublesome period, a traumatic period. That was very common in where I live in Jakarta, usually in the form of eviction. So as you made that presentation, I tried to draw some parallel to the way people adapt to the situations and how people would have to, make way spatially, but also as means of keeping families together, and I wonder, because at the same time, Indonesia is not does not ratify the Refugee Convention, but there's plenty of refugees living here. I think so many of them are from Afghanistan and from Somalia, and but because of the lack of that ratifications, many live, within the urban settings, in Jakarta, and I'm wondering if you've made any studies or into that kind of comparison between refugees living in a camp versus refugees living within like an urban environment, and the way homemaking actually would take place, and whether they would, I suppose, contribute better to the livelihoods of the refugees. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Camille, for your question. Actually, the two case studies, one of them is a camp, and the other one is in an urban setting. And what I try to show is I try to nuance the approach that is based on camp, no camp comparison, because this approach sometimes in some cases, in some research, they simplify and they link camp to temporary shelter and urban spaces to permanent home. And I try to show through my research that it's not always the case. And if I had more time, I would have shown other case studies in which I show how people in an organized camp. So Lebanon has not ratified the Refugee Convention either. So Lebanon, according to the UNHCR, is a country of transit, not a country of asylum. And as I said, camps were not allowed in the country. However, in one of the municipality, because I also told you that the municipalities became like small governance, and each municipality had its own policy in hosting refugees. So one of the municipalities in the Bekaa Valley, in the Bekaa region, it's called Ber Ilyas. And it's a municipality mainly of Sunni people, and refugees were Sunni. So they were more hospitable, and they had a good experience in hosting Palestine refugees earlier in the earlier years. So they were used to the idea of refugees. So this municipality allowed camps, allowed organized camps, not by the UNHCR, because Lebanon didn't allow the UNHCR to build camps, but they allowed camps from an organization on private land that was offered for the camp. And even though the principle of an organized camp, in most researches, they show how dehumanizing it is and so on. In this case, in this specific case, Syrian refugees received a lot of protection and privileged and were never evicted, not exploited, treated in a very human way, redesigned the camp and did the gardens and had pigeons. And of course, I had questions about this organized camps, like who was allowed in the camp and who was not allowed, on which basis people are allowed. So there is also power. It's invisible and it's unsaid, but there was also an issue of power. And also the camp was disconnected from the village because it was in a remote area. So I would say homemaking is I mean, the typology of space is, of course, important, but it's not central in the homemaking. Also, I went to Jordan and I did some field work there. I went to the Zaatari camp. The Zaatari camp is a city. It's a city. And if you compare it to the Azraq camp that the Jordanian government built afterwards, the Azraq camp is a camp, but the Zaatari camp is a city. Why? Because refugees were allowed to transform their shelters, because refugees were allowed inside and outside the camp and could get material. In the Azraq camp, the Jordanian government said, we learned from our mistakes and we will not do the same mistake. So the typology of space is important. The flexibility of space is important, but it's not central. What is central? Again, it's power. Whether refugees have access to material, whether refugees have the freedom to work on their spaces, whether refugees have money, whether they have a legal status. Jordan did a better job than Lebanon in hosting Syrian refugees, and even refugees in urban spaces. Not all refugees, only refugees who could get a sponsor. So we go again to the notion of power, because refugees who would get a sponsor and are able to get out of the camp are refugees who have money, and refugees who do not have money and cannot have a sponsor who would like guarantee them, they would be in the camp. And the Zaatari camp is an open air prison. It is a city. It has developed with shops. You know, it's bride shops and carpet shops, and it became urbanized, but it's still a closed prison, and refugees cannot leave without a permit and need to come back 3 days later, otherwise they're not allowed, and so on and so on. So it's very complex, and camp and urban space are not the condition. I hope I answered your question, Camille.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Faten, for your answer. So there's another question from Mas Kamil. Would you like to elaborate those questions on the chat?
Are you talking to me, Hani?
To Camille, he left question. Okay. Yeah.
You mean the question to Pak Yoyo?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, actually, I have a little bit of follow-up to Faten, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
When you said, if I'm not mistaken, you said that was it the Jordanian government that says we learn from our mistake or something like that? Can you just elaborate a little bit more? What I'm understanding is that the mistake is this allowing of goods and people to transfer between spaces. Would that be the case? And if that's a mistake, why would that be a mistake?
Well, Jordan is also a complex governance with tribes, and you know, sometimes the tribes are not very hospitable towards refugees. So the Jordanian government was very careful with that. When they did the Zaatari camp, they allowed the UNHCR to build, to place containers. Now the containers are rectangles, and Syrians are very handy men and women. So they did two things. First, they used the containers, and the containers, what the Syrians did, you know, the courtyard house of the traditional Syrian architecture with the, you know, the space in the middle where there are trees, and it's a multi-family house. They took the tires of a car and they would remove the containers from one place to another and reproduce the courtyard house. And they would use the tent that they were given before because the Zaatari is in the desert, to cover the courtyard, to protect the women from, the eyes of other men, and also to have some privacy and some freshness. They were able to do that, first because the structure of the containers was kind of flexible, and the second reason was because the Zaatari was not as remote as the Azraq camp. So what happened is that the Zaatari from a camp became a city with 80,000 inhabitants that would be almost impossible to dismantle. It doesn't show on the map. It's as if it doesn't exist, but it's actually as big as the fourth largest city in Jordan, which is insane.
So that's
what they did with the Azraq.
Yeah.
What they did with the Azraq, because that's not their purpose. Their purpose is not to create a city. Their purpose is to keep this temporary. But we talked about temporariness. Temporariness is a political notion. Actually, nothing is temporary. Well, what is temporary? Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 10 years? So what they did with the Azraq camp, they created shelters that were extremely hard to dismantle, extremely hard to displace, and they made sure that it was extremely far and remote from any urban area to avoid this from happening again. I hope I answered your question. Can you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Hope that's enough.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, okay. So one last question I will read because we already have Gabriela in here. But yeah, let's wrap up for the last question to Pak Yoyo from you as well, Mas Kamil, right? So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was also a really intriguing presentation by Pak Yoyo. For me, it's also a research stream that I've been quite immersed in the past few years. And there was one slide when you have that note on climate compliance. That seems to be like a way of regulating the world into a series of this. I would call it like a mapped commodities, like harking to what Brenner would say in his idea of planetary urbanizations, but not just these mapped commodities of what we would have considered as tangible goods, but also the invisibles. You talked about your friend of how seeing the whales as part of this. I think it was brotherhood, and also the chemicals and the atmospheric, all these intangibles. I would be interested if you could elaborate more on this and what it means for us. I guess, I mean, it's quite a broad question, but what it means for us to be able to resist this, insofar that we understand that the diminishing mode of spatial production that we have here, particularly, for example, in Indonesia, as everything is being mapped out and turned into commodities. How do we get to resist that and produce a different kind of space?
Thank you, Kamil. Just briefly, this is of course witty questions, but if we try to reflect a bit liberally Lefebvre's idea about space productions and urban revolutions, this is exactly the antinom, if I may, of space productions, including what Fatin just describes very nicely about the situations in Lebanon. This is exactly space demolitions and devastations everywhere, actually. And also, a few years ago, actually, I'm sort of contributing to discussions, very intriguing discussions with friends from France and others on the words disasters or catastrophe. And my little penis at the times is actually about the urgent needs to decolonize the idea of disasters. What Faten described, quite emotively about these refugee camps in Lebanon, it's actually, if you think through it, this is actually something like a sustainable disaster. It will be there, and we haven't even discussed about the spatial status, internally displaced people, which actually many millions of people actually qualified of being put into that UN category, but because of this interested politics, actually linked to the the conventions of the international law, they are not. In West Papua now, it's nearly 80,000 refugees and more dilapidated situations and conditions, mostly women and all that, and sometimes actually deprived, of food and all that. And so the first thing is actually to think about what sort of available source of sustenance for people in that kind of softly defined refugee situations. In many interventions that I did, and international interventions in Europe, for example, I use deliberately, of course, that Indonesian archipelago at the present moment is actually an archipelago of refugees, if you think about it. Many of us living in urban areas are sort of being blinded of this, reality, social reality. It's very pungent. But if you, 2 years ago, a group of lawyers in New York City asked me to write a piece on the fate of people in the Nickel Bowl, particularly in the Moluccas. So I wrote this, and if you're interested, I can send share the link. And within a few months, in the year of 2023, 15,000 youngsters from the nearby islands, West Seram, Saparua, Ambon, Haruku, and all that, they flock into the nickel mining and smelting process in industrial estates in Weda Bay. With no guarantees whatsoever about, if there is any job for them and all that. So they flock into this very, very filthy homing processes. And what's so saddening is actually with all these very difficult situations, the women workers, after all the sufferings from the work, in the evening actually sell their body to their colleagues. It's a kind of very ironic kind of work solidarity with their fellow workers. And so I now actually in the middle of a research to understand better the plights, particularly of the women in this new expanded extractivism projects in Indonesia. So if I were part of your team, Camille, and in a very innovative and trying to see a breakthrough in the way we architects should think or rethink our role in this kind of jumbled refugee situations, then what I would do is actually to start thinking, first of all, not about these artificial boundaries of life space, kecamatan and all other state jurisdictions, but try to understand what I called before historical, social, ecological entity, their life space, whatever they define. I know it's very complicated in urban areas, but in even that is not impossible. But in the island context that we all live in Indonesia, actually, it's very clear actually, and we've been practicing this with many different indigenous groups in the area. And so you can see that, okay, we have problems with waters. Now I work with colleagues from 5 countries, Colombia, Thailand, Brazil, and Indonesia, to understand the depletions of the only source of animal proteins for peoples in this artificially created refugee camps, in a sense. So they inhabit the ruins of the capital expansions, if I may. And so the first victim is actually the fish. In the Mekong, even just in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, every year they will get 4 million tons of fish. And now it's all gone because of the dozens of hydropower dams, of course, financed by China, but controlled by the Mekong countries. And it's the same in Papua, the same in Colombia, where women, since the Plan Colombia and all these conflicts in Colombia, now lost their life space. That is the Magdalena River, Rio Magdalena. This is the realm and the world of women there. And so it's gone, the fish is gone. And so they asked to collaborate on researching how coastal fish actually can become the new, lifebloods of everybody, of peoples in the Chaco regions, the coastals, from the Pacific to the Caribbeans. So what I want to say in closing this response to your questions, Camille, is actually we have to break away from the sort of being the algorithms so mainstreamed by the industry. Even though if you want to do breakfast, I like a bit, the works of Architects Sans Frontier in Indonesia, and it's also what I've been doing, and also when I was students in Sekolah Pertukangan in Bandung, and I always challenge my colleagues that we probably should start from listening very carefully how their lives changing. So the narratives should not be the narratives of us, the planners, the designers, the experts in it, but listen very carefully their inner experience, their collective traumas. And to return a bit on the Lebanon refugee camps, most of the camps actually started very long ago, even in 1949 and the 1950s. And then comes new waves of refugees, the Palestinians, and I've been following through in 5 countries there, all these plights, and try to work with academics in Australia and in Europe, actually, to understand how we can be of any help. And so we are now in conversations with the Kurdish, for example, with a group of Indian women who exactly try to understand all that Faten has been describing. And so I think that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pak Yoyo, for very reflective answer for us. And that also reminds me of my own practice as an academician. As one of my student raising this term capitalism, that the capitalism is a driving force of the ecological degradation, yet she cannot break free from the physical aspect of it. And sometimes that's the thing that we fail to see, that there's a bigger structure. Those things that you mentioned about historical, ecological, social entities that probably we have to shift to focus on to navigate our practice, not only just the design aspect only. So I think that is wrap up our first discussion session, and we have Gabriela Jamshukin here. And I would like to thank Faten first because I don't want to hold you on hostage now. It's already really late. And thank you for that. Thank you for your share with us. And I welcome Pak Yoyo if you can stay for the last presenter. it'll be delighted for us if you can stay. And now I would like to introduce our last presenter, Gabriela Demchuk. You're here.
Thank you, Faten.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It was an honor and a pleasure to present amongst everyone, and hope we continue the discussion later on with ASF Indonesia.
Yeah, thank you, Faten. Thank you so
I'm
much.
sorry for disconnecting, but it's 1 a.m. here and
yeah.
I need to
Yeah,
go to
okay.
sleep.
Yeah, thank you. Have a
Goodbye, everyone.
good night. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's 3 a.m. in Beleng.
Yeah, okay.
Oh my
So,
God, 3 a.m. Oh my God.
oh, it's 3.
Good luck.
Yeah, okay. So our next speaker, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, it seems it's already late at your place as well, right?
It's very early. It's 6 in the
Oh,
morning.
it's early, very early.
Yeah.
Okay. So I hope you have a fresh thought to share for this session. So I will introduce you first. So Gabriela Demchuk is a photographer and educator whose visual works explore displacement, identity, and the politics of place. Her practice bridges art, journalism, and activism using images to narrate the human and environmental impact of crisis. So Gabriela, the time is yours.
Great. Thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen. Wait 1 moment. Okay. Great. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, please bear with me a little bit as my brain is still waking up. Haven't had any coffee yet. I am currently here in London, where I moved to back in 2021. I came to study at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths University. And I come into architecture from a very unconventional way. I spent the last 10 years working as a photojournalist in Washington, D.C., where I was covering the White House, the Capitol, national politics, reporting on the machinations of American power, and the massive bureaucratic system that operates our country. And so I was there up close for about three administrations, starting with Obama, all of Trump's first term, and then the beginnings of Biden. And it was at this time that I started to understand more how policy is shaped through backdoor dealing, strong arming, campaign donations, but also at the same time how media, so not news media, but mediums such as images and texts and maps, paperwork becomes the bridge or the conduit to enact laws. And so as I was photographing in Washington, I was also really interested in understanding how these policies were impacting communities across the country. I was looking at both immigration, migration, and environmental impacts. And so I did a long reporting in Texas along the border there, especially in 2017, looking at Senate Bill 4, which was a bill that had passed in Texas, which made the entire state the border. It deputized ICE agents to arrest undocumented migrants, which really became the precursor to what we are seeing now in America with Trump's second term, how the entire country has now become basically the border. And then at the same time, also looking at the impacts of how environmental protection policies and laws were also being rolled back during Trump's first term in office. And so I was doing a very big project for the New York Times, looking specifically at different regions and the impact that these policies, these EPA policies were having. So we went to California to look at how the use of the pesticide chlorpyrifos was impacting agricultural workers who were working on the land every day, picking fruits and vegetables, how just being out in the fields for just 10 minutes was burning their skin, burning their eyes. We went to North Dakota to look at methane flaring in the Fort Berthold Reservation, and how on this reservation you had Native Americans who had land had mineral rights, and so they're actually profiting from the oil that was being extracted, and that money was then able to pay for schools and hospitals and services in this community. However, on the flip side, you then had these impacts to health, a lot of asthma, a lot of cancer rates, because of this uncontrolled flaring of methane that is coming from the production of oil. Looking in places like Baltimore, which has a toxic legacy, especially in the Curtis Bay region, right, in the Bay, where you have medical burning incinerators, a coal pier, this area of industrialization, and they wanted to build another trash burning incinerator in the community. And so there was a group of high school students who actually pushed back and stopped the building of the trash burning incinerator. And so these were, so I was working at different scales. I was looking at the top at this larger system of power, and then focusing and zooming into what was happening on the ground and how these policies were impacting communities on the ground, almost as a form of ground truthing. And so it's a process used by aerial image and remote sensing interpreters to measure and compare the ground elements with the elements that compose the image. And so working in these two registers allowed me to see the impact that these abstractions created by law was having at a very personal, community, and also molecular level. But it was also a practice, actually, like Hendro said, about listening. And so these 10 years, as I was working as a photographer, I was always behind the camera. I was looking, I was listening. And I think that sets me up to really start to bring this into a more spatial practice. And I wanted to focus on this project specifically as the seas rise. So I was asked to document ghost forests for the New York Times, which are large swaths of bleached and blackened trees seen along the east coast of the United States, where sea level rise is becoming a significant issue. As salt settles into the soil, trees and much plant life are killed from the roots up, slowly disappearing with the rising tide. I traveled along the eastern seaboard to witness these ghost forests for myself and speak with scientists and climate experts who are studying this new phenomenon. These ghost forests are the first warning signs of our changing environment, offering a glimpse into a future where communities will no longer be habitable, where land can no longer grow crops, and where histories and memories of place will be lost to the water's depth. What is specifically interesting is that, especially on the eastern shore of Maryland, we are seeing one of the highest rates of sea level rise, due in large part to land subsidence. So as the land naturally sinks, water rises 5 millimeters a year, faster than the global average of 3 millimeters a year. In the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, about 3,000 acres of forest and agricultural land have been lost between 1938 and 2006, with more than 5,000 acres of that marshland transforming into open water. And so you have nearby communities who are seeing their crops drowned, their cemeteries submerged, and their roads blocked, pressuring families to leave their homes altogether. And we also saw that the childhood home of the famed abolitionist leader, Harriet Tubman, who led slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Her home was recently discovered within these ghost forests, but archaeologists are worried now that they will soon lose it to the rising waters, an important site of American history and its legacy of slavery. And so with this project, I collected water at every site I photographed to make salt prints, an early 19th century process that uses salt water to develop images, evidencing how brackish water, a mix of fresh water and salt water, is now becoming more saline due to increased seawater. And so the aesthetics of these indexical prints mimic the stripping and bleaching effect that we're seeing in these forests. And so this project led me to learn more about how image making can be used as a methodology for sensing environmental conditions. As we have seen with this Ghost Forest project, the very materials used in the image making process can actually evidence toxicity, the changes in pH, the composition of soil, the health of plants. Images can actually become more than representational. They become both evidence and witness. And so I see photography as a critical tool in helping us to understand our changing world and the spaces we inhabit. And so this is what I am currently teaching in media studies, a practice-based course alongside the studio I'm teaching in environmental architecture. I teach graduate students across various architecture degrees at the Royal College of Art how to engage with media as a discrete object rather than simply as representational of a future build. So tasked with investigating an ecological concern of their choosing, my students use image making as a methodology to problematize, visualize, or evidence the impact of this material. The result is a series of hybrid image object prints in which the non-human entity is granted greater agency in the production of the image. This approach fosters more nuanced and complex narratives that decenter the human perspective and emphasizes human, non-human collaboration. And so here I have two examples of student works, one on the left by Antonio Cortez, who was using cyanotype on wool, and specifically looking at the sort of dyeing practice of raising sheep and producing and weaving wool in a specific village in Colombia where he is from. And then Ioana was looking at the history of communism in Romania, where she is from, and she was focusing on the story of a woman's prison. She's written 100 Red Onions to create Photo Developer to make a series of images that depicted the jail cell where a female prisoner wrote about seeing a piece of onion, which was the only vegetation that she had access to. And then two other student works, one by Georgina Docherty, who was making salt prints evidencing the toxic conditions of the bay in Southampton, creating a series of images reminiscent of portholes on ships, as this area is very busy with industrial shipping, causing a lot of pollution in the water. And Maya Vahidi, who was looking at the harvesting of saffron and the extreme care needed to grow and actually pick the strings out from the flowers. She created this accordion book that folds out with the poetic series weaving sort of these practices of care for the saffron, and then bringing these elements of the saffron into the actual image making production, using the oil, using the roots, using every aspect of the plant to actually create the images. And so all of this, these works, all of these different practices, looking at different scales, working with images and material, start to come together in this project, Wild Hedges, that I started with my collective El Wahat. We formed in 2022 with my collaborators, Arij Ashhab and Ailo Ribas. El Wahat is an artist research collective building communal and ecological practices of care and repair in response to growing aridity in the Mediterranean. we were interested in looking at the recent spread of the Coccinea insect, which has come into the Mediterranean and is now eating away at all the prickly pear cactus, as you see here in the photograph. We were looking at the history of this cactus and the Coccinea, and how this cactus actually comes from Mexico. And so during our field work in Oaxaca last year, we learned about how the Spanish conquistadors, when they came into the region of Mexico, they saw how indigenous communities there were actually using the Coccinea insect to create a red dye. And this red dye was incredibly brilliant and steadfast. And for centuries, they actually held a monopoly on this color red and gained a lot of their wealth by exporting the Coccinea back to Europe and then selling it. And so you would see the Pope's robes were dyed with the Coccinea, the British redcoats, the army was using Coccinea. Painters like Rembrandt would use it in their paintings. And so what we're seeing, and so the Spanish had brought the plant to the Mediterranean, hoping to cultivate the Coccinea, but the Coccinea didn't survive the climate, but the cactus did. And so it's spread throughout the Mediterranean region, where it has become almost indigenized in a lot of communities and has become a really important part of the community. And so now what we're seeing in the last 10 years is actually a new species of the Coccinea that has come in and is eating away at the cactus. And because the cactus hasn't had enough time, or the Coccinea hasn't had enough time in this region to cultivate natural predators, it has just become rampant throughout. And so this project starts to focus in more in Palestine, where the cactus has actually been used historically in the Levant region to demarcate property boundaries. And so a lot of villages that have been destroyed and depopulated, you still see remnants of the cactus. And so the cactus itself becomes evidence and a witness to these histories, these stories, these people. And with the Coccinea now coming in and eating away at the cactus, we heard from a lot of villagers and a lot of people around Palestine who were so upset by seeing these cacti that meant so much to them, also as a political symbol of rootedness and steadfastness. And so they were trying all different ways of getting rid of this insect using pesticides, other biological controls. They were burning the cactus, they were throwing oil on it, trying to get rid of it. And so something that we wanted to do was actually think about other ways in which we can actually work with this insect. And thinking about, rather than bringing in these biological controls and pesticides, how can we actually use the insect for more artistic practices, and especially for practices in local communities. And so what we started to see was that these artistic interventions of using the Coccinea for dyeing, for embroidery and weaving in local artistic practices, as well as the fiber itself, these dried fibers for building and weaving, and then also the pads, which can be eaten and used in food. These start to become practices of care and repair. And so by pruning the cactus, pulling out the dead fibers, and harvesting the Coccinea, we actually help the cactus to sustain itself. And so over the last 3 years, we started in 2023, we went back to Palestine in 2025 of this year, in May. we've been conducting different workshops, working with an organization called Salkia in Ain Kenya, just outside of Ramallah, as well as Sliman Farm. We've been working with the communities to really work together in thinking through how to use these materials. And so with Sliman, we were putting together a shade roof, weaving these fibers together, which they can then use in the summer months as shade during their own workshops. We were also looking at working with the cochineal as a pigment. And when we were in talks with Salkia, we had learned about a sacred tree and Sufi shrine on next to the organization that they have been working to renovate. And there's a practice in Sufi tradition of processions between sacred sites. And along these processions, these groups would take flags with them and as they're visiting each of these sacred sites and shrines. And so, inspired by this idea of the flag, we worked with women in the village and students to actually create our own flags that are symbolic of the sacred tree, the Kotlab tree next to the Sufi shrine at Salkia, as well as the cactus hedge that is in the middle of Ain Kenya that you saw in the images previous. And thinking through these two sites, both as sacred, and so bringing into the work more through the spiritual relationship, ecological mysticism, and so we gathered materials from these two sites, and then we gathered the cochineal, and we actually made ink, and then with that ink we created the flags. And as we were speaking with a researcher who's been doing more work around mysticism and Sufi traditions, he was talking about myth making and how we create myths to help us fill in the gaps of understanding. And so with these flags, we then brought this to Suha, who is a expert in Tatriz embroidery. And she actually started to fill in the gaps of these images and creating a much more holistic image of these flags. And so with the flag, we actually had a procession from the hedge in Ain Kenya up the hill to the sacred tree. And through this procession and through this work of creating together, we found that actually our presence on the site where it has been attacked by settlers and is always there's always the threat of settler attack of coming into this area and damaging the property. Just our presence alone actually helps to deter these settlers. And so in a way, the sacred tree, which historically has also been a space where people have gone to pray. They've taken pieces of their clothing, ripped it and tied it to the tree, asking for safety and praying to it. Our presence there then actually helps the tree in return, keeping it safe and safeguarding it. And so with its flag, we've started to bring this into more exhibition works, thinking through this connection, this relationship between the hedge, between the sacred tree, creating these textile-like hedges where we are printing with the cochineal, dyeing with the cochineal, embroidering, making images of these two sites. And then these are stills from a short film, a diptych that actually goes into the making of these flags and sort of the ritual and the spiritual connection between these two sites. And thinking through the color red, the red of the bark of the tree, the red of the cochineal as the thread that is binding these two sites. And then again, thinking through also the dried fiber of the cactus as another material, as another building material that we can create paper with. And so just finding new methods for creating with these materials that are often overlooked and seen as waste. And so in the last 3 years, we have been working with many different farmers, artisans, artists, land workers who have been working with the cactus themselves, working with the cochinilla themselves. And so we created this book, a recipe for patience, because the cactus in Arabic is called sabr or sabir, which means patience. And so we wanted to see the work that we're doing as a way of bringing all of these different knowledges from all over the world, from Mexico and Spain and Palestine, to create sort of a larger web of shared knowledges. And so we saw this opportunity of creating a book of recipes of how to take care of the cactus. And so in this book, it has recipes for pruning, for planting, for using these fibers, using cochinilla, different recipes for actually cooking with the cactus pads itself. So it's not just the fruit of the cactus, but it's also the entire plant that can be eaten, which is seen as a delicacy actually in Mexico. And so, yeah, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriela, to share us of your work, and that remind us that image making is not just the image itself, but it can be as an evidence of environmental crisis and other crises that we face in our world, basically. And when you mentioned about the cactus, that reminds me of another work that it was a documentary of eradicating olive trees, which was part of the identity of Palestinian settlement. I don't remember exactly in which settlement was there, but they were trying to reminiscing which part of the land that belongs to their families that is now already gone. And it was kind of like a strong message, from the photograph that they're having back then to the nowadays that is already gone. So now I will open question and answer a session. If anyone have a question, please raise your hand or leave something on chat. By the way, earlier, I think you missed Fatan's presentation. She was also talking about the refugee and Lebanese Syrian settlement. So it must be very interesting topics for you as well, considering your route. So now there's a question from Bayaya. Yeah, I think.
Thank you so much. Well, enormously appreciated, Gabriela. I think it's just eye-opening, and it's a mind-boggling actually what you managed to work on. It's
Makasih
really appreciated.
presentasinya Gabriela
Also,
memperlihatkan bagaimana proses kerja.
And also, I think I'm completely with you with your very sharp stance, and a political stance and all that. I have this ongoing research with my school actually on the like what you described actually, the intertwining faiths and you know life of historical processes in Asia and actually Turkey, you know, the whole Middle East and all that it's part of the big story actually. And I quite recently actually the journal that I work with, I'm an editor board of Commodity Frontiers journal, set up discussions about Sunil Amrit's book, fifth book. Sunil Amrit is an environmental historian at Yale and Harvard, and he sort of in one of the chapters of his books is called The Burning Earth. He sort of elaborated, you know, critical landmarks in the developments of the technology of power and conquest from the empires, big empires, you know, Mongolian and all that's in the past, all the way to the, you know, the current ones and the Chinese foray and all that. And during the or in the wake of the First World War, he described something as very moving actually. This is manufactured destructions. So the war brought up not only you know, deaths and all that, but actually changed the whole landscapes in Europe, including, of course, and particularly about the special element nitrogen. And this is, of course, related to nitrogen oxides. It's the key ingredients of bombs at that time. So he calls this a nitrogen nightmare, if I'm not mistaken, the you know, the chapter's titles. And in discussing with him, actually, I compare actually an illustrations in his books. I can, if I may, just briefly, can I share screen, please?
Yeah.
If I may, if that is okay. So he describes the earlier period when rice is spreading throughout Asia, from India, of course, with the idea of this is actually the food of the gods and all that. And so, okay, this is the things I'd like to share with. So let me see just a bit. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't get it. Maybe I just, okay, I just, sorry, keynote. Somehow I couldn't find it. Maybe here. No, it's not. Anyway, so I compare it with the exactly the same regions that cover Indian subcontinents and all that's all the way to West Papua in Australia. It's now the space for the Han, the Rus, to get cobalt and nickel throughout Asia, actually. So this is battery minerals, of course. And so there's a dramatic change in the way, you know, social history move on from the introductions of lacquer bucks in the past, you know, the technology to dyeing technology, just like the cochineal bucks, you know, in Palestine that you described, to as a dyeing agents. And so during the first part of this international trade, so to speak, in the first kind of world systems. The Chinese will go to Palembang in Indonesia to wait for the push of the monsoon wind all the way to the Indian Oceans. And in that particular transit area in Palembang, then they will exchange between beetle chewings and the lacquer technology from the cochineal box counterparts. It's a lacquer box, and it's very precious, and all the links there. And then I dig into the beetle chewing part of it. It's actually from Madagascar all the way to the Pacifics. It's actually we are united by these beetle chewings rites or ceremonies in this sense. And so it's very fascinating. And your work actually, I think, opens up a new collaborative field, I think, to think through all these pathetic developments on the parts of the northern governments, for example, but also of Turkey, for example, and with the transformed socio-ecological crisis that we face. And exactly through your commitment of being the witness in all these very complex processes, I think we can learn something together, real people on the ground, women and men and all that, and then we exchange stories. And I just thinking loudly about it. I would like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, and also something that I didn't mention was how the cochinilla not only came into the Mediterranean, but we also are seeing it in South Africa, we're seeing it in Australia, because the cactus was also brought into these different areas around the globe. But in these areas like South Africa and Australia, the conditions for the cactus was so good that it actually spread all over, taking over a lot of agricultural land. And so they started to see the cactus as a weed and a pest. And so they actually brought in the new species of the cochinilla in order to eradicate the cactus. And so what we are seeing is sort of these ideas of invasiveness, and how economics also plays a really big part of this. When a plant or an insect is not seen as economically valuable, we don't want it. It's invasive, it's a pest, it's a nuisance. We try to get rid of it. But once we see some sort of economic value to it, then we keep it, then it's prized. And so it also starts to show how language around plants and insects, but also even as people, especially within the migration, how these words and these meanings start to shift based on economic value. And so we also have to work a lot to start shifting these ideas of what is valuable, and it shouldn't be on economic. We need to find other ways of creating relationships with all of these different entities.
Yeah, okay. I think it'll be interesting to see the image that Bayoyo mentioned about
Yeah.
rice migrating. I hope that you can share that. If it is published, you can share that on the chat. But if not, yeah, maybe we will have like another time to share about this.
No, I'd like to share it if I may.
Yeah, sure.
I think I'll try again. Okay. Let me see. Okay, this is. So I presented during a women's meeting. So it's a Asian women's meeting very recently, just a few days ago, with people on the grounds, all women that work in the clandestinely, many of them in the liberated areas in Myanmar, in the Mindanaos, and all these new killing fields, if I may, of the expanded extractivisms brought about up by the energy transitions agenda. And this is the book, The Burning Earth, and so this is the situations that he described, and then I sort of compare it to the situations at the moment, just simplify it, of course, and where now exactly the same regions are becoming the area, the hunts for cobalt and nickel throughout Asia since 30 years ago, more or less. But actually, another thing is actually very recently this year I actually engaged in a symposium at Harvard and Brown University with people from Barcelona groups and women's activists, academics from South Africa and all this. And I actually then made very interesting and then befriend this is the name, Thomas Bartoletti. If you can see, maybe you can see, you cannot see on the screen because I move it. And he's a senior lecturer at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And he brought up also equally interesting work, just like yours. And he's engaged in a project, actually. It's called Insect Pest and Economic Entomology in Plantations. 1870 to 1930s, a multi-species history of global capitalisms. And this just then, engage us, the symposium participants, into very vibrant conversations with people who talk about the food regimes, energy transitions, and of course the Martian historians at Harvard, who fiercely say no to Trump's push to surrender to his policy and all that. So this is actually relates to my first mumbling, in a sense that would be good actually for groups like Architects Sans Frontières and all that, to start broaden the space for exchange, so we can learn more from the particularity of research done by the key figures like Gabriela. Thank you.
Thank you. Could, do you mind putting the name of, what was his name, Thomas, in the chat? I'd love to look more.
Yeah, I will. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have reflecting through the past 10 years, and I think we ecological awareness for that. So yeah, thank you. And now we move to Kevin. I think we have another question from Kevin Simanjutak. You can
Okay, can you hear my sound
yourself?
before? Is my sound clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your wonderful presentation about the usage of the cactus fiber. So it makes me excited about, I'm so excited about the usage of the cactus fiber that have you mentioned before, Ms. Gabriel, Ms. Denchuk. And I have questions. Sorry if it is too basic questions. So I'm still wondering about the cactus fiber for product, as you say, it is for product design or even for architectural features. I'm still wondering about, can you explain what is your consideration, why you choose the cactus fiber for your project? And then about the can you explain the correlation with the product design and architecture features? Thank you.
Yeah. So the cactus fibers, I should have mentioned this earlier. So the Coccinea insect has can only survive on the prickly pear cactus. And so it will lay its eggs, and then the insects, when it hatch, it starts to feed on it, and it will suck out all the water. And so that's when you start to see these dried fibers of the cactus. And so really, like, no one has really been using the fibers themselves. And so we saw this as an opportunity of using a material that's often seen as a waste, and is just disregarded, bringing that into a more of a building practice. And so my collaborator, Adij Ashhab, who is from Palestine, her background is in architecture. And so she has been focusing more on the fiber aspect of the work, and using it more as a building and making material. While myself, I've been more focused on the pigment aspect. But we see all of this as trying to think through how to use local materials to create locally. And so how to think through this issue of this dying cactus and these artistic practices as a way of also caring for the cactus, and then being able to reuse these biodegradable materials. And so it sort of becomes this very circular way of working with the land, and as well as creating more artistic interventions. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it's clear for me.
Mm.
Thank you for your wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So before we wrap up the session, I will open one last question from the audience. Yeah, okay. Yunita, you may unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Kak Husno. I'm just straightforward to my questions to Gabriela. This exciting presentations regarding how what is the situations in today, especially for Palestinian people. So I'm wondering, what's the part of you being a researcher in spatial, and then what is it? And then integrate it into photography, and then preserving, such as what's exciting me is the preserving the recipe from Palestinian. So in your periods of executions, how to I don't think we need to separate from artistic to what special designs thinking, but in your in your executions, how do you align them in terms of the spatial thinking, spatial thinking, and then make it into artistical media form? That's only my question. I mean, in the creative way, how we can communicate your works into something that should communicating a resistancy. That's all. Thank you, Gabriela.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, well, for our collective, I think we have many different outputs. So along with these sort of artistic practices, we do a lot of writing as well. So that's one way in which we are bringing this research together, and putting it out. We went to Mexico last year to do a lot of research on the history of the cactus and its use and its connection back to Palestine, which we then wrote about in the Avery Review out of Columbia. And we just recently have been writing more about sort of the myth and Sufi practices related to the flags that we created, which is coming out soon for the Sharjah Triennale architecture. And so we see writing, exhibitions, these artistic outputs, all as different ways in which we can get our research out, and to think more spatially about the work that we're doing. But also, I think the work also changes depending on the context. So what we are doing in Palestine is very different than what we might be doing in the Netherlands, for example, where the exhibition was held. We will never be able to recreate the conditions in Palestine in different places. And so how the work transforms is really important depending on where we are in the world. And so I think what we are doing in Palestine is more of a community intervention, more of a work with community, rather than just seeing it as a artistic practice or artistic work. And so yeah, so it's I guess what I'm trying to say is that our work is always shape-shifting depending on the audience, depending on the context, depending on the geographical location, but always keeping in mind the community that this project is based in and rooted in, keeping in mind who we're working with, and again, trying to think more about all of this as a sort of a web of creating these shared connections through the cactus and the cochinilla. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriela and Unita, for the question. And that will be the last question for today's session. And to conclude the discussion, we have moved the discussion from structure to space to image. And I want to remind you again of the Payoyo presentation, that he reminds us that the climate crisis is deeply structural, and it is rooted in extractive system that have ruptured our historical ecological unity. And then earlier, Faten also brought us to discussion of scale of a home, showing us how people in conflict rebuild and reclaim space amid unequal power and instability. And finally, Gabriela have insightful thought, turning realities into powerful visual testimonies, revealing how images can serve as evidence, as memories, as well as resistant against the erasure. And a sincere thank you for all of the speaker, to Payoyo, who stayed until very late, and also to Gabriela as well, to wake up very early, and to Faten, especially even though she's already left, and for all of your contribution to all the participants who joining us today. And also, please don't miss the second session that will be held next week on Saturday, 15 November, the same time. There will be Prof. Wiryono Raharjo and Dr. Sri Suryani, who will extend this discussion towards institutional and education approaches in critical special practice. So thank you once again for everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.